INFJs don't just get tired, they burn out from the soul outward. It's not physical exhaustion alone, it's emotional overload from constantly holding space for everyone else. They absorb too much, think too deeply, and care too quietly. And when that inner light starts to flicker, no one around them even realizes how long they've been running on empty. This video will take you inside the INFJ burnout cycle, what causes it, what it feels like when your empathy turns heavy, and how to recover in a way that restores your balance, your purpose, and your peace. Because burnout for an INFJ isn't weakness, it's a signal that your energy needs to be yours again. If you've ever felt emotionally drained for reasons you can't explain, stay until the end. You'll finally understand why you give so much and how to heal without losing the parts of you that make you rare. Subscribe to Brainy One. If you see the world deeply, love quietly, and feel everything too much, this space was made for you. And before we dive in, let me know in the comments, what's the first sign you notice when you're starting to burn out? Emotional absorption overload. An INFJ doesn't burn out because life is loud, they burn out because they absorb what others never even notice. It starts slowly, almost gently, like rain collecting on a quiet rooftop. They walk into a room and unconsciously filter every emotion, every shift in tone, every unspoken tension. Someone's anxiety sits in their chest. Someone's sadness settles behind their eyes. Someone's anger lingers in their shoulders long after the conversation ends. They're not trying to be a sponge, it's simply how their nervous system is wired. While most people hear words, an INFJ hears the emotional frequency underneath those words, and it leaves a residue that builds up inside them. They notice when a friend is pretending to be okay. They feel tension a second before it's expressed. They pick up on emotional microexpressions hidden in silence. And because they care deeply, instinctively, relentlessly, they internalize the emotional environment around them. Even when they're tired, they keep listening. Even when they're overwhelmed, they keep absorbing. Even when no one asks, they keep carrying. Burnout doesn't arrive with a dramatic crash, it shows up quietly, like emotional static. Their dreams become heavier, their patience thins, their body feels tired even after rest, their mind becomes foggy from overloaded emotional data. They start avoiding messages, calls, social interactions, not because they don't care, but because they've cared too much for too long. What makes it harder is that no one sees this happening. On the outside, the INFJ looks calm, collected, supportive, the steady person people rely on. But inside, a storm of absorbed emotions is swirling with no pause button and no off switch. They carry heartbreak that isn't theirs, fears they never felt, pain they never lived through, and eventually, the weight becomes too much for one soul to hold. Emotional absorption overload is the moment an INFJ's internal system maxes out, not from their own suffering, but from carrying the suffering of others. And when they finally pull back, retreat, or go silent, it's not rejection, it's survival. Because until they empty what they've collected, until they release what never belonged to them, they can't feel like themselves again. When an INFJ burns out, it's never because they stopped loving, it's because they loved beyond their limits. The silent weight of empathic responsibility. For an INFJ, responsibility doesn't begin with words, it begins with feelings. They don't wait for people to ask for help, they sense the need long before the request ever forms. It's an instinct, almost a reflex, carved into them by years of being the emotional anchor for others. They walk through life quietly, carrying invisible loads, a friend's self-doubt, a sibling's fear, a partner's stress, a stranger's sadness. And because they feel everything so intensely, they assume a responsibility that no one assigned, but everyone benefits from. They're the person who checks in even when no one checks on them. They're the one who notices subtle changes, the tremble in a voice, the forced smile, the hesitation before someone says, "I'm fine." They sense emotional fractures like cracks in glass. And instead of stepping back, they step in. They listen deeper, care harder, support quietly. Their empathy becomes a silent contract with the world. "I will hold space for you, even if it costs me pieces of myself." But this responsibility is heavy, far heavier than anyone realizes. People grow used to their steadiness, their emotional intelligence, their ability to understand what others can't articulate. Suddenly, the INFJ becomes the strong one, the wise one, the stable one, the one who will always hold the weight because they always have. And the world forgets that even the strongest hearts have limits. Over time, the INFJ begins to feel emotionally indebted, as if every problem they sense is somehow theirs to soothe. They stay up late comforting others, replay conversations for clues, manage the emotional climate of relationships, and quietly adjust themselves to keep peace. They sacrifice their own needs because someone else's pain feels louder. They ignore their exhaustion because someone else needs support. Swallow their overwhelm because they don't want to burden anyone. And this responsibility is silent because INFJs rarely ask for help. They don't want to disrupt, inconvenience, or shift emotional weight onto others. They'd rather break quietly than make someone else uncomfortable. So the pressure builds inward, layer by layer, until their soul feels crowded and their spirit feels drained. The silent weight of empathic responsibility is one of the core reasons INFJs burn out so easily. They carry a world that was never theirs to hold, and they carry it alone. The overthinking spiral that drains energy. Inside an INFJ's mind, thoughts don't simply appear, they multiply. Every conversation, every tone, every glance becomes a puzzle piece in a vast emotional equation they're constantly trying to solve. Their minds are built like complex systems of cause and effect, always tracing behavior back to meaning. Why did they say it that way? What did they really feel? Did I do something wrong? These questions loop endlessly, turning simple moments into intricate webs of interpretation. Overthinking isn't a habit for an INFJ. It's their mind's attempt to create order in emotional chaos. Their intuition and empathy combine like twin lenses, magnifying every nuance until it becomes overwhelming. A small misunderstanding can replay 1,000 times in their head. A minor shift in someone's tone can lead to hours of quiet analysis. While most people move on, an INFJ stays behind, examining the emotional debris to find clarity. But clarity rarely comes. Instead, the spiral tightens, each thought feeding the next until their mental space feels cluttered with emotional noise. The irony is that this depth, the same gift that makes INFJs incredible listeners and healers, becomes their greatest source of exhaustion. Because while they're solving invisible problems and decoding subtle meanings, they're burning through energy reserves that no one sees. Their body feels heavy, their spirit dull. They try to sleep, but their mind doesn't rest. It replays, reanalyzes, reinterprets. Even in silence, their thoughts talk louder than words. They don't overthink because they're insecure. They overthink because they care. They want to understand everything, to prevent hurt, avoid conflict, protect peace. But the more they analyze, the more detached they feel from the present moment. It's like trying to fix a mirror by staring into its cracks. The more you focus, the more distorted everything looks. Eventually, the INFJ reaches emotional burnout, not because the world demanded too much, but because their own mind refused to stop giving. Their thoughts become heavy like fog, their emotions tangled in their own empathy, and so they step back, not to isolate, but to breathe, to remember what it feels like to feel without analyzing, because recovery for an INFJ begins when they stop solving every thought and start allowing themselves to simply exist. People-pleasing disguised as kindness. For most INFJs, people-pleasing doesn't start from weakness. It begins with love. They genuinely want others to feel safe, understood, and valued. They sense discomfort in the air before it's spoken, and their first instinct is to fix it. They offer understanding before it's asked for, forgiveness before it's earned, and empathy even when it's undeserved. But what begins as compassion slowly morphs into emotional servitude, a quiet pattern where peacekeeping replaces authenticity. INFJs often believe that harmony equals healing, so they overextend. They say it's okay when it's not. They agree to plans they don't have energy for. They absorb others' emotions like a sponge, convincing themselves it's their role to balance the room. Each compromise feels noble, even selfless, but underneath, resentment quietly grows. They begin to lose themselves one small yes at a time, not because they crave approval, but because the idea of someone else being hurt feels unbearable. The trap is subtle. People start mistaking their empathy for endless availability. The INFJ becomes the one everyone runs to when things fall apart, but rarely the one people check on when the dust settles. They become emotionally overdrawn, drained from giving without receiving, yet still smiling through it all. Because on some level, they equate their worth with how well they can hold others together. But burnout always follows. The INFJ eventually realizes that their kindness has been weaponized, not by malicious intent, but by patterns that reward self-sacrifice. They notice how easily people assume they'll understand, how rarely they're given space to fall apart themselves. The realization hurts, but it also awakens something powerful, the understanding that saying no isn't cruelty, it's self-respect. When INFJs stop people-pleasing, the world often calls it coldness. In truth, it's clarity. They stop explaining their boundaries. They stop apologizing for needing space. They stop mistaking constant availability for love, because real kindness, the kind that heals, doesn't require self-erasure. And that's when they reclaim their power. Their compassion becomes selective, their presence intentional, their energy sacred. They learn that protecting their peace doesn't make them less kind. It makes their kindness real again. People-pleasing drains them. Authentic empathy revives them. The difference is simple. One demands exhaustion, the other requires self-worth. The collapse of internal boundaries. When an INFJ begins to burn out, it's rarely because the world became too loud. It's because their inner walls began to crumble. For so long, they've relied on invisible boundaries to keep their emotions organized, what's theirs, what's others, what they can fix, and what they can't. But as their empathy keeps stretching beyond reason, those walls begin to blur. They stop distinguishing between feeling for someone and feeling as them. Their emotional field becomes crowded, layered with borrowed sadness, unresolved conflict, and unspoken pain that isn't even theirs to carry. This collapse doesn't happen overnight. It starts subtly, disguised as compassion. They tell themselves they're just being kind, supportive, understanding, but soon they begin absorbing everything. Tension in a conversation, anxiety in a friend's silence, disappointment in someone's tone. Their intuition keeps scanning for emotional imbalances, and their empathy keeps answering calls that were never made. Piece by piece, their sense of self dissolves into everyone else's emotions. By the time they notice, it's already too late. The INFJ feels like an emotional ghost, present everywhere, belonging nowhere. They start losing clarity about what they want, they feel, they believe. Every boundary that once protected their peace now feels like sand slipping through their fingers. It's not that they don't know how to say no, it's that they no longer feel where no begins. This is the most dangerous phase for an INFJ, the quiet erosion of self beneath layers of empathy. They may appear calm on the outside, but inside, they're suffocating in the weight of everyone else's emotions. The mind becomes foggy, the heart feels heavy, even rest stops being restorative because emotional noise doesn't turn off with the lights. And recovery only begins when the INFJ dares to rebuild from the inside out. They start by remembering that not every emotion they feel belongs to them. They begin grounding themselves in solitude, separating their truth from borrowed pain. It's not coldness, it's cleansing. Reestablishing internal boundaries is the INFJ's way of coming home to themselves after being emotionally homeless for too long. And once they do, they don't just recover, they evolve into someone who loves deeply but never loses themselves in the process. The disconnection from self. At the height of burnout, the INFJ experiences something deeper than exhaustion, a quiet, haunting disconnection from who they are. It's not dramatic or loud, it's subtle, creeping in through overextension and emotional fatigue. They wake up one day and realize they don't recognize their own reflection, not physically but emotionally. Their thoughts feel foreign, their desires feel muted. The empathy that once gave their life meaning now feels like an open wound that won't stop bleeding. They've spent so long tuning in to everyone else's emotions that they've forgotten the sound of their own. The INFJ's inner world, once rich with purpose, creativity, and intuition, now feels eerily hollow. Conversations no longer nourish them, they drain them. Their once razor-sharp insight turns blurry, and even the things that used to bring peace, reading, writing, solitude, lose their spark. It's as if their soul hit pause, but the world kept moving. This disconnection often follows years of emotional overcommitment. The INFJ becomes everyone's anchor, the friend who listens, the coworker who understands, the family member who always shows up. But in becoming the emotional backbone for others, they neglect their own spine. They forget to check in with their feelings, to ask, what do I need or what do I feel? They stop being participants in their own life and become observers instead, watching themselves fulfill roles they no longer connect with. When this happens, the INFJ doesn't explode or rebel, they quietly fade. They withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they've reached a level of depletion that words can't explain. They might still smile, still help, still function, but it's autopilot. The light behind their actions flickers. Inside, they're longing for reconnection, not with others, but with the version of themselves they lost somewhere along the way. Healing begins when the INFJ stops trying to serve and starts trying to listen, not to others, but to their own silence. They rediscover themselves in small, sacred moments, a walk at sunset, a journal entry, a tear they finally allow to fall. Slowly, they begin to return to their center, not as the person they were before the burnout, but as someone wiser, softer, and more aligned. Because the disconnection wasn't the end, it was the soul's way of saying, come home. The retreat into solitude for reset. When the noise becomes unbearable, when the INFJ's mind feels like 1,000 radio stations playing at once, they do the only thing that has ever truly healed them. They disappear. Not out of bitterness or rejection, but as an act of quiet self-preservation. Solitude becomes their sanctuary, their medicine, their reset button. To the outside world, it may look like withdrawal, but inside, something sacred is happening, the slow and deliberate process of coming back to life. In solitude, the INFJ finally exhales. They no longer have to interpret the emotions around them or carry the invisible burdens of others. The stillness feels uncomfortable at first, the silence too loud, the space too open, but over time, the quiet begins to reveal what the chaos had buried. The INFJ starts hearing their own voice again, faint, uncertain, but familiar. They begin to realize how far they've drifted from themselves and how desperately they've missed their own company. Their solitude is not loneliness, it's detox. Every moment spent away from people becomes a filter that separates borrowed emotions from genuine ones. They read, reflect, walk under the stars, or simply sit in stillness. And in that quiet, their mind, once cluttered with empathy and noise, begins to organize itself again. The world slows down, the pressure to fix, to heal, to help fades. And what's left is the INFJ's pure essence, calm, discerning, and deeply intuitive. In this space, they begin to rebuild, not through grand gestures or sudden clarity, but through patience. They learn to say no without guilt. They rediscover what peace actually feels like when it isn't shared or negotiated. Their thoughts become sharper, their emotions lighter, and their soul steadier. They start realizing that solitude was never about running away. It was about finding the courage to stop running toward everything that drained them. By the time the INFJ emerges from solitude, they are transformed. Their boundaries are stronger, their empathy balanced, their purpose renewed. They don't announce their return and they don't explain their absence. The people who understand them won't need explanations, and the ones who demand them no longer deserve their energy. Solitude didn't make them distant, it made them whole again. And from that wholeness, they rise quietly, not to please the world, but to live truthfully within it. Rebuilding through intentional recovery. When the INFJ reaches the point of complete depletion, recovery cannot be accidental. It has to be intentional. Healing becomes a conscious practice, not a byproduct of time. The INFJ knows now that simply resting isn't enough. Their recovery demands structure, honesty, and purpose. They begin by identifying what quietly broke them: the unspoken expectations, the one-sided emotional exchanges, the guilt of not being enough. Each realization becomes a small act of reclaiming power. The rebuilding phase is delicate. It's not about reinventing themselves, but remembering who they were before the exhaustion blurred their identity. They start setting boundaries, like rituals, not to keep people out, but to protect the energy that keeps them alive. Every no becomes a quiet affirmation of self-worth. Every pause between obligations becomes a breath of self-respect. The INFJ begins to redesign their life around peace rather than approval. In this phase, they gravitate toward authenticity, people, routines, and goals that feel nourishing rather than draining. They simplify their emotional landscape, choosing depth over distraction. Maybe they return to journaling, painting, or meditating at dawn. Maybe they start saying what they mean instead of what's expected. Small choices, made consistently, start creating momentum. The fog that once clouded their mind begins to lift, revealing a new kind of strength, calm, grounded, and deeply aware. What's most powerful about this stage is that the INFJ no longer chases balance, they build it. They learn that recovery isn't linear. Some days, it feels like they're starting over, and others, like they've reclaimed the world. But through it all, they move with intention. Every step, no matter how small, is directed toward alignment, the reunion between their inner peace and outer purpose. And when they finally look back, they don't see weakness in the burnout, they see wisdom. The INFJ realizes that breaking wasn't failure, it was revelation. It stripped away every false layer, every obligation that wasn't theirs to hold. What's left is truth. Quiet, steady, unshakable. Intentional recovery taught them that peace isn't found, it's chosen again and again. And now they protect it with the same devotion they once gave to saving everyone else. When INFJs finally recover from burnout, something extraordinary happens. They no longer chase peace in people or places, they create it within themselves. The old patterns, overgiving, overthinking, overfeeling, no longer define them. Instead, they live with balance, protecting their calm like sacred ground. Their kindness no longer costs their peace, and their empathy no longer drains their power. If you're an INFJ who's been through the same silent storm, if you've ever felt unseen, exhausted, or misunderstood, remember, your healing doesn't need to be loud to be real. The quiet rebuilding you're doing right now is strength in its purest form. You deserve a life that feels as gentle as your soul. If this spoke to you, take a second to subscribe to Brainy One. It helps this community grow and reminds YouTube that content like this matters. And tell me in the comments, what's the hardest part of your healing journey right now? I read every one of them.